They were deep, too deep for any human boot, too spread for a bear. Each print was an impression of pressure and weight, toes only hinted at, long and oval, heel sinking into the duff. I stopped so fast my bar slid under my forearms. The Mini DV's red tally light blinked steady. I thumbed the record switch without thinking. Silence came down around me like a hand. Not the ordinary forest hush after human noise fades, but a deliberate wait-and-see hush. No bird call underscoring the world, no distant chainsaw, an absence that fell heavy. The air smelled strange. Under the damp leaf rot there was a mineral, clinging and sharp, and a faint, oily sweetness I would later, in the hospital after the wrist had been x-rayed, try to name and fail. The prints were fresh enough that the faintest smear of moisture still glittered in the mid-morning light. I took off my glove and felt the damp, cool air. My fingertips prickled. For a moment I thought of coyotes or an unusually large elk, then of hunters, and then, absurdly, of stories told around beers. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the word floating in my head like a weathered sign. I made a decision that I replayed and dissected over the next decade without ever convincing myself I'd done the wrong thing. I dismounted, took a closer look, and pressed the camera toward the prints. The viewfinder held the trail, the prints, my hands, the slight sway of my chest as I breathed. I walked a circle around the impressions, every crunch loud, and the camera followed. All my training and observation clicked into place. Spacing between steps, the heel-to-toe pressure, the breadth of the forefoot. The stride length implied something 7 to 8 feet when upright, and the pressure pattern suggested a long arm swing, not a quadrupedal animal. My heartbeat had lifted, but my voice stayed a practical thing, as if narrating to a client. 10 centimeters deep, I said to myself on tape. Stride about... I stopped. It felt obscene to quantify what could be a living being into a checklist. I should have called Chen right then. Amanda Chen worked the Forest Service district office 20 miles over. She was steady, the kind of ranger who had inherited patience and an eye for practical detail. But pride made its small, compact room inside me. I was a builder. My instinct was to gather evidence, to be certain before I brought others into an honest scare. I wanted to see more than prints. I wanted a line of footage I could point to without sounding like someone telling a campfire story. So I climbed back on. The first glimpse happened 3 berms later, where the trail kinked and the trees opened into a small clearing. I saw it in peripheral motion, an impression like a darker tree that moved with purpose. The camera caught the motion as a smear of matted fur between trunks, and heart rates on the tape jumped as did mine. It was upright, not quite human. Broad shoulders hunched to clear the branches, long arms moving with a deliberate economy. When it saw me, it didn't bolt. It stopped on the far fringe of the glade and turned. I remember the sound it made more than a face, a low, coordinated vocalization, almost a chord made from breath and throat. It wasn't a scream nor a growl. It was a question and a claim at once. 3 beats, then silence, as if the forest itself was listening for an answer. You ride through a lot of danger as a racer, roots, rocks, blind drops, but predator awareness is a different animal. I pedaled the next few strokes like my life depended on the bike, because in that moment it did. The camera bobbed, the tape jittered. I taped my hands tight on the grips and pushed speed into the berm. The thing moved then, faster than I would have given it credit for on that terrain. It didn't run like a human sprint. It covered ground with astonishing economical bounds, swinging long arms to balance, feet landing flat with a soft thud that I could hear over my own exertion when I listened back. It kept distance, but it kept pace. My rational brain tried to fit it into known categories: deer, bear, man, while the rest of me accepted a new taxonomy I had no words for. Pursuit is granular. It happens in fragments you can replay and articulate later as if you were stitching together a film strip of survival. The crack of my front tire against a root, the way air filled my throat like a pulled bellows, the staccato of my breathing through my nose, the occasional thwack as leaves slapped at my forearms. The camera angle made every close call feel cinematic. I could see the tightness of my line when I crouched, how my hips shifted to absorb impact, how my fingers squeezed the brake levers with a kind of precise panic. I remember thinking in short, almost useless facts. Keep weight back, don't overbrake the front, pick a line through the rock garden that avoids the biggest roots. That focus is what saves you when instinct wants to do something stupid. At the top of the rock garden, there was a shelf, a small, unguarded rollover I had built to test the suspension. I took it too flat at speed, the front lifting half a second late, and my wheel hit a hidden stump. The suspension folded, my handlebars yanked, and the bike unstitched itself. I remember the world slowing, the way everything does when impact is imminent, like someone turned down a dial on the universe. I went over the bars and landed under the lip of a fallen log, arms taking weight instinctively. Pain flared, immediate and mechanical. I knew without looking that my wrist was wrong. The camera skittered, tape catching a fragment of sky, a tree trunk, and then static blur as the helmet slammed. I couldn't hear the chase over the ringing in my ears. My hand felt useless, the bone giving in a way my mind tried to translate into metal, a wrenching angle and a snap of disbelief. I crawled under the log and clamped my teeth around the taste of dust and cold sap. Through the leaves I could see movement, 3 forms stepping into the shaft of sunlight in the meadow. They paused at the edge like hunters deciding whether the prey was worth the risk. I pressed my face to the ground and watched them in the camera's last steady frame before the impact had knocked the lens askew. Tall, broad, matted fur, shoulders rolling, arms long enough to touch their knees when they turned. They did not approach the log. They stood, considered, communicated in a low compendium of sounds I would later describe as organized and almost conversational. Then one of them stepped forward and did something I had not expected. It crouched by the creek, dipped a hand into the water, and lifted it to its face as if to taste the day. They didn't attack. They didn't bite or tear. They observed from the meadow's lip, and after a few minutes, maybe 3, maybe 10, time had warped under the log. They backed into the trees and vanished. The fact that they left me alive did not feel like mercy. It felt like a decision that made me smaller and more accountable than any rescue could. Ranger Morrison and Amanda Chen arrived an hour later, because Richard, who had been out on a salvage inspection near the lower switchbacks, came across my Tacoma and followed a trail of dragged tire and my abandoned bike. Richard's voice on the radio was taut when he found me. "Derek, you okay?" And then he was at my side, asking controlled questions. Morrison, younger and blunt, had that skeptic's tone you get when you've heard 1,000 calls and nothing. while Chen moved with slow, authoritative concern, setting a splint like someone who'd done this before and understood the arithmetic of pain. "Fracture, likely, distal radius," she said later in the hospital hallway, pragmatic and calm. "I had a cast for 6 weeks and a scar in the shape of a small crescent where the skin had torn." We sat in the Tacoma's cab while Chen and Morrison walked the meadow. Rain had started by then, the kind that turns the undergrowth dark and makes prints into statements you can read with a little patience. Chen found the prints, and they were fresh enough that the edges of the impressions still held the glue of the morning. She looked at them, then at me, then at the VO strapped to the handlebars. "You have tape?" she asked. I fumbled in the jacket pocket and handed her the mini DV canisters like an offering. 6 tapes, H1 through H6. The rack of the truck held our damp gear, the rain tapping down in even little ticks. Chen did not immediately ask to play them. She tucked them into a plastic bag and closed it like she might a small evidence sack. "We'll log them," she said. "Chain of custody, standard procedure." Morrison had a phone with a cracked face. Back then, the Forest Service used radios mainly. Someone would take a tape to the district office and log it, but Chen's eyes were already on the larger question. If this is what we think, publicizing it will bring hunters, curiosity seekers, danger, she said quietly. Her voice had that professional contour, tone flat, but the implication heavy. I had imagined, even hoped, for vindication. I had imagined a documentary filmmaker knocking, a magazine spread, the proof that would make skeptics eat their words. Instead, I felt a tightness in my chest as Chen said the words I lacked courage to voice. "We have to consider the animal's welfare." The ethical calculus unfolded in the months after with a clarity I would later teach to project teams and to volunteer trail crews who wanted to oppose logging near the meadow. It was a slow, aching arithmetic. Footage equals proof. Proof equals public interest. Public interest equals pressure on a fragile piece of land. There are places that should be kept quiet to survive. As a trail designer and steward of that place, I knew how fast an unguarded secret turned into a corridor of destruction. Hunters come in, then poachers, then souvenir collectors, then the closure of a place under the foot of commercialization. Once you put coordinates on something, you can never take them back. Back at the station, the tape was cataloged. Chen argued for restraint with a tone that was almost religious in its conviction. "We have jurisdictional tools," she said. "We can apply for special management status, coordinate with the state, limit access. But if somebody leaks a frame, a shutter, a bite..." She did not finish, but the rest of the sentence was implied. The meadow would become a spectacle. Richard, when I told him, was not a romantic. He ran a small environmental contracting outfit and had helped fund my trail projects in the past. "If you have tape," he said the next day over coffee and the greasy spoon at the highway junction, "you can make a case to the county and the land trust. That could protect the land." He folded his hands. "But you also have to think about people. Think about all the new people who'd come. Are you ready for that?" I wanted to be ready for being right. I wanted to be vindicated. I wanted somebody to say, "We knew you were telling the truth." The small man in me wanted the validation that drove publications and lectures and the kind of respect that fills rooms. But the trail builder in me, the one who had sleepless nights thinking about erosion and root exposure, knew that the real work was protective infrastructure, not applause. So we complicated the paperwork instead. Chen quietly logged the tapes, placed them in a restricted bin at the ranger station under a policy memo that cited unidentified large mammal activity without dramatic language. The district applied for a conservation easement on the meadow, arguing that it was a rare wet glade critical to several listed understory plants and an important corridor for elk. Richard leveraged a conversation with a land trust he knew. He got an application moving with letters written from my shoulder, technical notes about trail impact, hydrology reports, a professional's plea to keep the area in a low-access state. There is a temptation in people to think that proof is an open claim, that if you have evidence, you must wield it. I felt the pull as keenly as anyone. In private that winter, I digitized the tapes at home. I had learned to capture mini DV via FireWire, bring footage into Premiere 6.5, scrub frames, adjust exposure, stabilize shaky segments with the rudimentary tools I had. I watched the tape in the little light the desk lamp made and felt again the small animal panic, the strange chord of the vocalization that had made the hairs stand up on the back of my neck. The camera didn't show everything. It cut in a few crucial frames when it jarred during the fall, but it held more than enough to prove that something anomalous had been moving in that meadow. I burned a master DVD, pulled a copy for myself, and then, against every instinct I'd felt for personal fame, I did not send it to anyone but Chen and Richard. The months after the incident were an education in slow politics. The land trust moved cautiously. You can't argue, we need to protect this because of an unnamed cryptid in boardrooms and expect sympathy. So we used the language that made them listen. Rare habitat, fragile hydrology, cultural value of an intact meadow. Richard's donation of a small easement payment, along with an argument I wrote about long-term stewardship costs, gave the trust the leverage to purchase a conservation option. Chen and the district put in a request for seasonal closures and an enforcement plan for the summer. For the public, the story remained trail reroute for habitat protection, and that was precisely how we wanted it. The ethical debate didn't end there. I lost sleep over the tapes I had in a drawer. I watched them sometimes, my finger tracing frozen frames, the creature's shoulder angles, the way one of them bent to drink from the creek. Once I watched it play twice in a row and felt something like grief for what I'd withheld from a world that insists proof is the only currency of belief. Then I remembered the meadow in summer, wildflowers cut short by too many footsteps, a muddy path where children had looked down expecting to find a monster. I chose to keep it safe, not famous. People who never faced the sound of something large moving through Douglas fir can be cavalier in their curiosity. Over the years, friends asked me to release a still, a frame, a single definitive clip. A minor channel once offered a sum to buy exclusive rights to the footage in exchange for a public reveal. The offer was tempting in the way all quick gratifications are. It would have paid off some of Richard's easement costs and would have made me a small celebrity in that subculture. But the more I thought about the trajectory of exposure, the clearer it became. The only honest stewardship was to let the meadow be more important than my name. There were consequences. Skeptics called me a liar. 2 online forums, obscure then, heated into a small firestorm of ridicule when a coworker once posted a shaky, grainy photo she had taken of the prints, a different, less refined observation that was quickly spun into a joke. I felt bruised by it. Part of me wanted to respond with tape to show every frame and let them decide. But the other part, maybe the older, quieter part, took solace in something else. The meadow's wildness preserved, the easement secured, the trail rerouted away from the most delicate root systems. Chen visited a year later and said, "We haven't seen them again in that corridor." She said it like someone closing a file. But we do get calls in the fall about strange sounds, and the seasonal closure is working. My wrist healed, but it left a thin, puckered scar and a new cadence to my writing. I stopped doing the kind of test runs that leaned on brute speed and began teaching more. I gave talks at state parks about responsible access, co-authored a pamphlet on minimizing trail impacts that included a paragraph on why you don't publicize wear locations. I kept a ritual. Once a year, around the same week in October, I would sit with the tape drawer and play the tapes back, not looking for fame, but to remind myself why I had chosen secrecy over spectacle. Each time I watched, I saw different things. Shoulder movement that suggested a lineage of motion more animal than human. A hand that cupped water with delicate attention. The way they paused in the meadow, not to ambush, but to consider. My interpretation was always cautious. I wrote my observations in a thin notebook. Possible coordinated vocalization. Intentional restraint suggested. Notes meant for a scientist, never to be made public. There was one day, a year and a half after the incident, when the moral weight shifted to something resembling vindication. Chen called me at home, voice even. "The land trust formalized the easement," she said. "They cited your reports, and the county accepted the seasonal closure. We've secured a no public road access lane and will monitor with non-invasive methods. Keep your tapes where they are." I remember leaning against the counter and letting the news anchor a slow warmth. Not victory exactly, a relief tied with recognition that something fragile had been spared. Not everyone agreed with the choice. A documentary producer left a polite but persistent voicemail that winter. He wanted access, exclusive interviews, footage for a broader narrative. He framed it as conservation. If the world saw this, they'd protect it. He spoke easily about publicity as protection, as if exposure and stewardship were synonyms. I declined. Chen supported my decision. "Publica fascination is a blunt instrument," she told me the next time we met over a county conference table. "We used the social machinery quietly to do conservation work. We keep the meadow safe, not famous." The field of cryptozoology attracts both humble researchers and showmen. I respected the former, those who pressed with careful presence, who logged tracks and scat and samples and petitioned for serious scientific inquiry. I feared the latter, the men and shows who raise a place with lights and bait and cameras, who turn living things into props for ratings. My choice to keep the footage private sat somewhere between professional humility and a parent-like duty to the land. It was neither heroic nor cowardly. It was a stewardship decision that felt to me like the only honest one. The tape sat in a locked file cabinet at Chen's office, labeled in her handwriting with a date and a note that read, "Restricted, sensitive habitat." Richard sent an annual check to the land trust as a quiet debt of gratitude. I rode less dangerously after that, teaching, consulting, spending afternoons modeling trails in my garage shop instead of chasing personal records. My silence made some people angry, others reverent, most indifferent. But the meadow bloomed each spring, and 15 years later, when I had gray at my temples and a shoulder that grumbled in wet weather, I walked a new trail with a volunteer crew and passed the place where the three of them had paused. The flowers were dense, the air full of bees and high sunlight. No crowds, no cameras, just the sound of wind and a faint memory. There is one image I keep returning to in my head, that of one creature bending to the creek, lifting the water to its face with care, then tasting the air as if cataloging the day. It wasn't human, but it wasn't mindless either. It exercised restraint in a way that complicates the predatory narrative popular culture prefers. That decision at the creek, do we engage or do we observe, felt like an ethics sermon delivered by a thing with fur. It taught me that restraint is a form of respect. I still receive messages, even now, from people who want to know what I saw, to see the tape, to verify. I answer carefully because the stakes remain. Disclosure is not a simple act of sharing. It is a code that can open a place to harm. When I do speak, I aim for accuracy over flourish, telling the sequence of events as the record allows and insisting on the protection that followed. I do not romanticize. I do not call them monsters. I call them what the footage suggests: large mammals of unknown classification, observed behaving in ways that imply social structure and restraint. In private, sometimes late when the house is quiet, I will pull a single frame from the archived DVD and look at that static blip of brain and shadow. The frame is a study in restraint. Shoulder, forearm, a hand caught mid-air. The rest of the world sees a pixelated silhouette. I see a creature that chose to walk away. I see my own youth and hubris, and the moment I learned to weigh proof against protection. I could have sold the tape. I could have let it feed 1,000 hungry shows and turned the meadow into a destination for curiosity and profit. Instead, I helped build a quiet defense, the easement, the seasonal closure, the education programs that taught riders to stay on designated trails. Some companions called it cowardice at the time, others called it sanctimony. In the end, it was a responsibility I assumed because I knew the fragile geometry of that place, the hydrology, the root systems, the places where human footsteps ate a bank away in 3 seasons. If you ask me now whether I regret the silence, my answer is a long sentence. I mourn the facts I did not push into the light because I could imagine how the light would burn that whole corridor to a new shape. I celebrate that the meadow remains, in many ways, as it was. And I accept the loneliness that comes with keeping a secret meant to protect rather than to possess. There is no neat moral ledger to close. I live with the tape like a low ember, useful, warm, not something to throw on the nearest gossip bonfire. The forest keeps its secrets. Sometimes people keep them too. I rode again, but slower. I taught others to read tracks and to replace stakes and to reroute trails when routes begged it. I wrote an article for a regional conservation journal about the ethics of disclosure without naming the creature. It drew a few readers and a handful of angry letters, but it also seeded a conversation about the responsibility of access. When Chen retired, she left me a note tucked into the office logbook. "Good call," it said, simple and unadorned. Morrison wrote a more elliptical message years later when we ran into each other at a community meeting. He'd gone into wildlife rescue for a spell. And he told me, gruffly, that he understood why we had kept the meadow quiet. Richard's investment paid off. The land trust maintains a buffer zone around the easement to this day. The tape remained under lock. I am older now. I still take the tape out sometimes, place it against the desk lamp, and let the little red tally light glow like an eye that sees but doesn't speak.
I still ride, but I measure my speed with a different yardstick, the impact that this single decision had on other lives. Fame would have been loud and speedy and ultimately destructive. Silence was deliberate and slow and, I believe, kinder. If you found yourself hoping for a public revelation, to see proof and point and then file away the story like a spectacle, I'm sorry. The truth I want to leave you with is less dramatic and, I hope, more enduring. There are things in the world we do not own. Our role is stewardship, not ownership. The meadow speaks in ways that do not require an audience, and sometimes the bravest act is to keep a secret that protects life rather than amplifies curiosity. I'm still asked sometimes if I ever considered releasing the tapes under embargo to a university or a panel of scientists. Yes, I did. But any research arrangement would have to come with ironclad agreements, monitoring plans, and, importantly, local protections that outlast the ephemeral attention of funding cycles. The reality is that with institutional involvement come leaks, politics, and the slow corrosion of a place's privacy. The safest path for the meadow was through patient, local conservation that added layers of legal protection rather than public spectacle. Some nights I dream the meadow differently. A small child runs through the glade with a net, laughing, and the creatures watch from the edge, and, perhaps, because they are as curious as we are, they move closer to see. Those are hopeful dreams. Waking up is always a small disappointment, the world unchanged. But when I walk through the careful corridors of the trails I helped build, when I see volunteers plant native sedges and reroute a shortcut worn by impatience, I feel the caution of that October morning shaping work that outlives my impulses. There is one last thing I want to say, and it is short and not sensational. The animals I saw chose to step away. That choice, more than any other part of the story, taught me how to choose. For every person who wants spectacle, there are orders of magnitude more life forms that depend on our restraint. That has been the echo of the meadow. Once, in a wet spring, a young woman came with a tattered grant proposal folded in her palm and a pair of well-used boots on her feet. She introduced herself as Amira, a student of landscape ecology who had spent 2 summers tracing the edges of wetlands and the margins of species ranges. She had read my article and had the nervous, hopeful look of someone who thinks the right data will put the world to rights. She asked plainly if I would consider letting her study the meadow. I told her what I always tell people who lean too quickly toward curiosity, that the meadow is not a specimen under glass. It is a crowded, breathing thing that tolerates human presence only insofar as we remember to be less interesting than the wind. She listened, head cocked, the way people do when an elder is telling the rules of an odd, strict household. When I said I would not make the tape public, no embargo, no university archive without ironclad protections, she did not argue. Instead, she asked what protections I would want. She asked about buffer zones, about long-term monitoring, about trusted custodians. Her proposal was careful in a way my earlier, more academic comrades often were not. She recommended a community advisory panel that included local residents and volunteers like the ones who had replanted the sedges, legal clauses that forbade media access, and a physical protocol. Any samples or data taken in the meadow would be anonymized, georeferences masked, and all files encrypted and handed to the land trust under a quinquennial review clause. She suggested a plan for stewardship funding that relied on long-term endowment rather than grants with sunset clauses. There was, in short, more thought for the things that come after the researcher's career than I had the right to expect. I told her I would consider it. I set a test. For 2 seasons, she would work at the edges of the meadow under the supervision of our volunteer coordinator, learning the trails and the idiosyncrasies of the place, how the rushes fall in a different way after a hard winter, how the air has a particular smell when a brood of frogs has moved in, what a fresh set of tracks looks like at dawn. She accepted the test without drama. That willingness to be patient impressed me more than any credential on a page. During those months, I watched her with a restrained pride. She learned to close the gate behind her. She learned to bend to the roots instead of forging a shortcut. She learned to listen more than she announced herself. I began to think, although I did not say it aloud, that if there were to be a person who might someday steward whatever the tape showed, she was less dangerous than a headline-hungry reporter and more durable than a graduate student hungry for a CV. Then, as if the meadow could not resist the gravity of human curiosity, someone trespassed. A contractor working on a property 2 miles from the easement took the wrong track home on a foggy evening. He did not mean to go near our boundary, only to make a shortcut beneath the pylons. He found himself in a low corridor of willows and, seeing a glow of lights in the trees, stopped to take a photograph of the mist. He posted it to an online forum, nothing identifiable, he thought, only a pretty patch of marsh. And a poster with a thirst for the unusual took the image as evidence. Rumors slipped sideways and then forward like water under ice. Someone else, seeing the rumor, called a small local paper. The paper called a regional blog. Hyperbole came quickly. Mysterious creatures, strange footage, secretive land trust. Within a week, there were emails I hadn't invited, and a voicemail from a journalist with a tone that assumed I owned either gold or scandal. It is always dangerous to have a secret that someone else wants to monetize. Secrets, unlike trees, have a way of catching wind and becoming combustible at strange, fragile points. I began to hear from neighbors who wanted to petition the land trust for access, and from strangers who wanted exactly what the rumor promised: evidence to post and sell. The meadow responded by slipping farther into itself.
Tracks I had once seen with clarity became older, more indistinct. At night, there were fewer lights along the far ridge. The creatures, which had been observant of human restraint, retreated a foot at a time as if recalibrating their map of nagging disturbances. I called Richard. He picked up on the second ring and, in the vaguely amused way that only he could muster, asked if I had finally decided to cash in. I told him the truth. The meadow was being sketched by rumor. People were looking to make it into a spectacle. He swore under his breath, not curses at me, but at the idea of attention deployed like a shovel. He agreed to ride into the land trust office the next day and talk to the board. He also arranged for the trust's attorney to draft a stricter, more explicit prohibition on publicity and to enforce the buffer with notices and patrols. Morrison, meanwhile, offered the brusque comfort of a man who had survived too many things to be surprised by human folly. He said simply, "We lock the tape deeper." We talked about options, burying it, burning it, giving it to a repository with conditions. There was, in all those options, the bone of the same problem. The tape's existence would always be a pivot between people who would use it to care and people who would use it to claim. If the tape never existed, if it had been a dream of my younger self rather than a reel of magnetic humiliation and wonder, the meadow would have been spared the burden of being a parable. But then I wouldn't have had knowledge of what happened that October morning. Knowledge, too, is a kind of companion. It alters how you move through the world. I did not destroy the tape. I locked it deeper into the safe and wrote a letter, short, legalistic, and final, detailing my wishes. The tape should never be public during my lifetime. When or if it were to be transferred, it should be to an institution with explicit, legally enforceable commitments to the meadow's protection.
And even then, only under a quorum of trustees that included community members, not solely scientists or donors. I left instructions for a sealed review, and I insisted that any institution take on some form of stewardship clause that included habitat protections that could not be reversed for at least 50 decades. It was a hedge against the hunger of institutions that change directorates like seasons. There is a peculiar solitude in drafting legal wishes for objects that may outlast you. You imagine the people who will read those clauses after your hands have gone cold. You try to foresee their weaknesses. You try to write such that their greed will find more friction than easy leverage. It is a clumsy, practical form of love. The land trust tightened its protections. Volunteers increased patrols. We installed an unassuming motion-activated camera to monitor the very edge of the buffer zone. Not to catch anything in the meadow, but to see who crossed into proximity. It was not the tape. It was plain, low-tech surveillance that respected the meadow's interior while offering us social leverage. Proof, if needed, that there had been trespassers and that the board had acted. Amira stayed. She earned, in the end, a grudging kind of permission to work with the edges and to submit anonymous datasets to the trust under a chained access plan. She learned to carry a kit for restoring trampled plants and to talk to neighbors without romanticizing the animals. She learned that the most heroic acts of conservation are not dramatic rescues, but small, repetitive decisions. To replace a stake, to reroute a trail, to take the time to plant sedge plugs in the right season. In the quiet months, she would find me beneath the old oak and ask, sometimes, what I saw the first time. I answered with fragments, never the real itself. And she would nod the way someone hears a story not to possess it, but to be guided toward humility. Not all of my acquaintances stayed. A man I had known at the university who had once praised my field notes told me that I was hampering science. His tone, newly sharp with the odious hunger of tenure and attention, made a claim I could not respect. We stopped meeting for coffee. Another woman who had once come to the meadow with a child's exuberance toward the outdoors stopped returning my calls. The rumor had made her angry in a way I could not soothe. People take different positions. Some see the quiet as cowardice, others as sacrament. Those who left made small crossings to other communities, and that too was its own kind of loss. There were small consolations. One autumn, a class of children from the town's little school came with their teachers and a volunteer lineup. We kept them to the outer edges and taught them to find a safe place to sit and be small. A boy named Eli sat with his knees tucked under and watched the meadow as if it were a living book. He saw a fox's tail vanish into the rushes, and when I asked him what he felt, he said plainly, "I feel like it trusts us when we don't shout." He was 10 years old and had said, without irony, what I had learned in my adult life. When he left, he hugged the volunteer who had shown him how to plant a sedge plug. Later that winter, I received a crayon drawing from Eli's class. A ragged green meadow, a small brown fox at its edge, and, in block letters beneath, the caption, "Keep quiet, keep safe." The drawing sits above my desk like a talisman. Time reshapes even the neatest intentions. The creatures in the meadow changed their habits in response to us. Some nights the chorus of amphibians is thinner, and some years a particular bird does not return in the numbers it once did. But the plants we coaxed back into health have established themselves in resilient patches, and the water flows stubbornly like a vein that prefers not to be seen. I have watched volunteers come and go, young people who are now older and calmer, who understand that guardianship requires lending one's patience to something else. The land trust's buffer, once contentious, has become part of the town's language. Children who grow up with that corridor in their memory treat it as an ordinary, non-negotiable place. They value it without requiring celebrity. There were nights, though, when curiosity made maps of my hands. I thought of whether to ever show the tape to anyone who had not earned the place at the table. I imagined, sometimes obsessively, the moment of a reveal. The first frame, the stunned hush, the paragraphs of explanation that would have to follow. I imagined the kind of people who would sit in a room and with gravity and no salaciousness, whether the world could hold this knowledge without being altered by it. But the meadow had already taught me that there are things the world cannot hold without reshaping itself. The tape was not an answer to be given lightly. It was a responsibility to be borne. In the empty afternoons, I think about the ledger of small decisions and how they accumulate into a life that is, in the end, less about proof and more about habit. I have learned to let my pride in having seen diminish into gratitude for having been allowed to see. I have had offers to speak at conferences and to write a more comprehensive paper, and I turned them down more often than I refused. Publicity is a bright thing. It burns everything it touches into a simplified outline. The meadow, which lives in the messy textures between roots and water, does not respond well to that kind of flattening. My body has its whispers now. There are mornings my back complains when I mount the old mare, and nights when sleep arrives like a reluctant ally. I think sometimes about how I will pass on what I have guarded. I once believed stewardship was a private duty. Now I see it as contractual in a larger sense, an agreement with a place and with the community that grows into the place. I have been drafting, revision by revision, the clause that will bind the next steward. It is not a romantic document. It is written in the plain language of covenants, obligations, timetables, the necessity of local inclusion. I have insisted that any trustee be someone who knows the meadow's sounds, who understands the likelihood of false alarms, and who has the patience to wait for slow, generational change. When I imagine the future, a quieter version of fame appears. Not headlines, but a slow pedagogy. I imagine a teacher bringing a new class, a family sitting quietly in the summer dusk with a child between them, the child looking up at the stars and imagining the meadow as an ally rather than a zookeeper's exhibit. I imagine the tape less as an artifact and more as a stern teacher that insisted we learn discretion. Perhaps that is the vanity of old age, to turn what should be a technical curiosity into a moral anecdote. Maybe it is not vanity at all, but the only language I have left for the thing I would hand on. There are nights when the meadow offers small rewards. One winter, a pair of animals, smaller than the ones I saw in that October, but with an inquisitive body shape that made my chest go tight, came to the fringe and stayed for a week, skirting the shadow of the buffer, watching us with a distance that felt like appraisal. I watched them from the low ridge with Amira, who had become less a student and more a fellow custodian. We did not move. We sat and let the cold seep into our bones, and the animals, satisfied by our quiet, angled away and melted into the trees like ink in water. On that night, I took the tape out, held it to the lamplight, and for the first time in years, I felt neither the urge to make it an exhibit, nor the itch to bury it beneath indifference. I felt only a calm recognition that some things are best carried as an ember, small, warm, and tended. I put the tape back into the safe and locked it. People sometimes ask me if I regret not showing the world. They imagine that some moment of revelation would have absolved me of the weight I've carried. The truth is more complicated. There are disappointments threaded through the choice, yes, but they are the sort that soften rather than harden. We have learned, collectively, to be less hungry for spectacle and more conscious of the slow obligations of caretaking. Perhaps the greatest advantage of secrecy is that it forced us to grow a little slower, to repair in measured increments, to plan beyond the next grant cycle or headline. There remains, of course, the practical work. I check the trails in the mornings, writing notes on moisture and plant vigor, meeting volunteers who bring their thermoses and a sense of what kindness looks like in practice, often practical, rarely showy. I attend board meetings and, with the blunt diplomacy that ailments of age breed, argue for the legal language that will protect the meadow after I am gone. I counsel Amira when she grows frustrated with the slowness of institutional change. I ride with newcomers and show them how to crouch low beside a reed and be less than a threat. The thing that surprises me sometimes is the slow way betrayal gives way to trust. People who once sought publicity come back, more humbled, seeking instead to help fence a boundary or teach a class for local children. The town itself has been remade by the meadow's quiet presence. It has learned to value not the spectacle of rarity, but the ordinary dignity of a place that does not need an audience to be itself. I do not know how this will all read in 100 years. I have tried to write instructions for that future, to bind love into clauses and enforce humility with legal language. It is an awkward thing to do, trying to legislate tenderness.